time for the Daily Detangler. Making sense. What do you think of when I say that? Wow, I hope he makes sense. Or are you thinking about, how do I make sense? Trippy, right? Well, we're going to talk about making sense of the world around us, making sense of what we're receiving, what we're seeing, and taking a bit of a holistic look at the human nature of sense making, how we relate, what we experience, and how we make sense together. A lot of this content's come out of my own journey and my own experience to make sense of this idea of being customer focused and being customer centric and going to customer. That's been a long journey to really understand that. And it's one of those things where the more I get into it, the more I realize what I don't know. And that makes me curious. Whereas in the past, it would make me really, really anxious. I love this picture, your comfort zone versus where the magic happens. Comfort zone. What is that? Well, it's how I process information and what I do. I'm the king of context. I always want more context. I want to know the background. I want to know how things are related so that I can understand them. The challenge with that is when I'm in my own known context and how I make sense of the world, I'm in my comfort zone. And that shapes what I do and how they interpret things. For me to move over where the magic happens, it's a whole new world. How I process things and what I do is different. Yet human nature tells me to hold on to what I know. And the world around me tells me to anchor in and double down and dig my heels in on what I know. I mean, I have a PhD. I've been, studying, and my dissertation has been on what I know. So how do I let go of what I know, or better yet, build on top of what I know and use what I know in a different way where the magic happens? What does that look like? Well, I think of this as an iceberg, and what I pay attention to and what I focus on creates a bit of an interruption. It's inconvenient. And if you've ever been a business owner before, talk about getting outside your comfort zone. If you've ever tried a new sport, you physically get outside your comfort zone. If you've ever put yourself into a new environment, for example, this cold water on the screen, it's a completely different environment. And I've spent a lot of my life in different environments. I've spent time in the military environment where I was an officer. I spent time in the research environment where I was an analyst. I spent time in the sales environment where I was a salesperson. I've spent time in the business environment, starting my own business. I've spent time in the academic environment. I was actually an assistant professor at North Carolina State University for a while. I put myself into sports environments, whether it's soccer or mountain biking, all these different environments. And for me to be successful in each, I've had to really grind it out. And I've had to learn how to do the hard work, and I've had to put the work in. And these new environments create interruptions and, stretch me. And that's part of how I make sense of it, by immersing myself in that environment. So sense making is very experiential. And one of our principles is it's the experience stupid. It's hard to make sense when we don't get into the experience, right? So what does that mean? Well, immersing ourselves in the current experience of what is a customer conversation. Do we really know what that is? What is the environment of that customer conversation? Do I really understand what's happening as we try to figure that out? I like this quote from Tony Robbins. Everybody's got a past. The past does not equal the future unless you live there. A lot of my sense making has been based on what I've known. I mean, I don't know about you, but I make a lot of sense based on my past. The challenge is it doesn't equal the future unless I choose to live there. I've done about 100 of these detanglers, these episodes, and probably the first 50 or more were based on what I already knew. Why do I do this? Why do I focus on what I've already known? Well, it's like, because that's what I know and I'm comfortable there. If I'm comfortable in the United States, it's what I know. If I go to another country, I'm not comfortable there unless I learn techniques, methods, approaches, routines, technology, people, and I learn how to tap into those things. So I can make sense of it based on being in the now, and that's really important. And I've learned that it's important to be in the now and to understand the different environment. We also make sense based on what we know and how we interact. Have you ever heard, hey, we don't know what we don't know? I know I have. I've said that a lot. I don't know what I don't know. And I kind of wish I would have started saying that earlier. When I started, my academic work, it was a lot of, I don't know what I don't know. But I've slipped into this idea of I already know, I already know, I already know, I already know. And our scientific methods approach and our scientific approach of inquiry and observation, asked me to, suspend what I understand and what I know and observe the world around me. And if I plot these out, what I understand versus what there is to know, I interact with a lot of different things, whether it's information or emails or processes. I make sense that way. I make sense on what I'm experiencing by the problems I face, the stories I share and listen to, the videos I watch. By interacting with the world around me, I basically try to find ways, and my brain is wired to find ways to simplify. And I can academically go about this, figuring out what there is to know and what I understand, or I can do it and I can engage. So when I plot these out, there's what I understand, there's known and unknown what I understand, and there's known and unknown of what there is to know. In the bottom left, there's what I know, right? That's I know how to ride a car or drive a car. I know that. I know what there is to know and I understand how to drive a car. I also can get into what I don't know, I know. For example, I might know how to skydive, but it's unknown how to go about it, right? I can talk about what I know that I don't know. For example, if I don't know that there's a type of eel that is poisonous, I don't understand it. I don't even know that it exists. And then there's the unknown unknown. I don't know what I don't know. And spending time in that space really is the essence of going to customer. Dealing with the unknowns on the right side is all about going to customer and trying to figure out the new conversations that we need to have as we catalyze change. And, especially in a post-COVID world. And I think this is why Catalyst loves the quote, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." This is why. And what does that mean? And as I explore this, and why does he rail against best practice? Because best practice is, what we already know and what we already understand, and let's just do it. It's the easy. It's the easy. Somebody else has proven it. Let's just do that. when it comes to what's known and what we don't understand, that we know that basically we have, unconscious competence. We don't know that we even know it. For example, flying an airplane. People can just fly the airplane because they know how to do it with all their training. They kind of forget everything that they've learned. They just know how to do it. It's hard to explain. Then there's the unknown known, what we know we don't know, and being curious there and having that humble curiosity to figure it out and ask questions and have empathy and engage. And then there's the top right. And I'm going to call that fortunately or unfortunately unaware. Fortunately, I'm unaware how a nuclear reactor actually works. It's a lot of detail. Unfortunately, I'm unaware of how customers make buying decisions and figure out how to navigate email security. And what am I going to do about that? How am I going to make sense of that? And the interesting thing about this is this perspective, this aperture, if you will, this lens through which I look at making sense. I've had to learn how to be more, comfortable with what I don't know, especially in that top right box where we spend most of our time being in a space of we don't know. We're unfortunately unaware. Let's figure out what to do about it. And when I think about making sense, it's very easy to make sense by myself. And I did a whole detangler on this. And making sense by myself is like, it really is really easy to live in the past or, try to figure out the future. Living in the past can actually lead to depression and loneliness because, you always are thinking about the past, and then thinking too much about the future leads to anxiety. So figuring things out by myself creates a lot of complicatedness. And unfortunately, though, on the right side, there's a lot of effort to really focus on our own individual journeys. The world tells me that I need to figure it out, that I'm on my own journey, and I'll be damned what anybody else thinks. And it's up to me to figure out, and I don't have to explain myself to anybody. I'm on my own personal journey. So, I don't need to be transparent and authentic. It's up to me to figure out. And I think, this is a lot of being an American or in an American business. We don't want to admit when we don't know something. But, asking myself, well, how do I make sense? And saying, well, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, what do I need? And well, for me to make sense of this, I really need what? Well, for me to make sense of this, I really need to understand how this is going to work. Well, for me to make sense of this, I really need to understand and see what it looks like at the end. For me to understand, I need to understand all the context and all the background. For me to understand, I need to know exactly what's going to happen tomorrow. For me to understand, I need to understand how this relates to everything I've learned in the past. For me to understand, I need to understand and know for sure what template to use. And if I just ask myself, well, why do I need that? I mean, I just rattled off a bunch of things I, used to tell myself I need to understand the world and make sense of it. But why do I need those things? And very often it's to relate to the past. 99% of those asks that I have is to live in the past. Those things that I think I need are so that I can relate to what I already know. And that's not what we're doing. It sounds like a good idea, but it doesn't free me up to innovate. And it doesn't free me up to live in the right now. And I have to learn how to be uncomfortable with that. And it's like building a puzzle, and that's the power of making sense in a group. Making sense by myself can really create a lot of drag on our ability to work together and figure it out. Building a puzzle by myself is a lot harder than building a puzzle with a group. So what is happening here and I've really watched our team to try to figure out how are we group sense making. Is there such a thing as group sense making? I spent a lot of time on individual sense making, but what about group sense making? How does our team make sense? Make sense of what? Make sense of the challenge, make sense of the puzzle. How do we interrelate with each other? How are we sharing perspectives, not with the goal to, be the smartest in the room, but with the goal of moving forward? How are we doing that? How are we figuring things out together? And how are we tapping into that? And, it makes me wonder and ask myself, well, what's the value of group sense making? Logic would say, well, the more people you add, the slower this gets, or the more people you add, the more contentious this gets, or the more friction, or the more people you add, the more people I have to persuade to my way, right? That's the human nature of the group. If you believe that, it's all about the past and what you already know. But as we've talked about in our heroes' journeys and our storytelling and our evolution of a human nature and how humans are uniquely connected and want to be in connection, and they have survived since the dawn of human existence by working together to figure out how to make fire, to figure out how to hunt bison and mastodons. That's been the human nature of figuring things out. And today is no different. That's how we evolve. That's how we grow. So where does that growth come from? In a volatile, uncertain, and complex, ambiguous world and environment that we work in, I have to ask, and I used to focus on, well, I want to be right. I want this to be accurate. Is that where growth comes from, though, is being accurate and being right? Or does growth come from figuring out what works? And this is an important distinction that I've learned being on our team. What works is what matters. And if it ain't working, fix it. As Cletus would say, right? Hey, that ain't working. Try something else, right? And what does it mean? What does it mean for something to work? And isn't that the pinnacle of sense making? Figuring out in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world how to make something work is the epitome of sense making, and it is the holy grail of growth, right? And yet, I used to spend so much time on trying to get things right, and that's a doesn't lead to growth, especially today when we have to factor all these things in. It's interesting. I spent time with a client, and the whole entire focus of the conversation was, well, we are hearing that our meetings are terrible. The meetings we're having are terrible. And I built this training to run a better meeting. And, long story short, it's a volatile world. There's a lot of changes. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of complexity with conflicting interests and disjointed processes. There's a lot of shifting perspectives. And because of all these things, meetings suck. And people are showing up in COVID on these meetings, and they're just terrible. And we're hearing a lot of complaints about meetings. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to build a training. And I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. So I said, what is the training? Well, it's an hour-long training. And we built this toolkit. And I said, can I see it? It's a 35-page toolkit on how to have a meeting. In other words, because of this VUCA environment, we're going to create this complicated, convoluted 35 pages on how to have a meeting, from how do you set up the meeting to how do you have expectations. I mean, I could go on about this, but the point is, to try to get meetings accurate created a lot of complicatedness. Instead of asking a simple question, why are we having meetings in the first place? Why are we having meetings and why aren't they working? Nobody's asking that. Instead, it's more and more and more. So when it comes to making sense of these things, there's a lot of variables. So one of the ways I think about it is, an individual needs to make sense. the group needs to make sense, and then we need to work together. And that's the balancing act of what do we figure out and how do we get stuff done. So to help with that, I built this kind of framework. And when I think about the prototype phase, figuring stuff out, there's an individual view of figuring things out, and then there's a group view of figuring things out that we've been exploring on our team. And then obviously there's this idea of getting stuff done, and how do we get stuff done in the prototype phase isn't in an individual silo, it's through this idea of collaboration and working together. So when I look at what these things look like, what they sound like, and how they are created, how is group sense making created? It's through storytelling and creative conflict and shared experience. How is individual sense making created? It's by leaning into past experiences or acquiring new knowledge or doubling down on what's specialization we have. That's how we make sense individually. What does it sound like? Well, individually, it's about me and I. In groups, it's about we. How are we doing? How is our team doing? And then in collaboration, it's the language of action, the language of doing. And then I thought about, well, what are we doing at Growth Enablement? What's our approach we're taking to help figure stuff out and get stuff done? We're focused on this idea of stone soup as a collaborative process to bring a bunch of different perspectives together in the story sense. How do we use a simple story as an analog for a collaborative process? We're also focused on the outcome. We don't know exactly what we're going to build to achieve that outcome, but we have to do that together. We have to engage in group collaboration, group sense making and collaboration, not focus on individual sense making. But to help with individual sense making, there's coaching that we provide and knowledge transfer. There's a lot of artifacts that we can share for individual sense making. But when it comes to group sense making, that's what we're trying to drive. And our approach is really aligned to that idea of helping the group work together, which means we need to understand things like, who's the hero of your story? Is it you or the customer? What are these story builder elements? What is the path? What is the journey? Who is the guide in your company? These are all group sense-making artifacts and questions that help drive and galvanize the team to figure things out and tap into the collective wisdom of everybody. And then we've got our idea of let's, role play this out. Let's collaborate and beat the crap out of it. And that's how we make sense and get stuff done, right? So when we are getting stuff done and getting the crap kicked out of things, it's not because it's not accurate. It's because we're figuring it out and figuring out what works. And I think that's been the challenge of a lot of sense making is feedback is filtered as it's not accurate. Whereas the feedback that we want to drive is, how do we make this work? We're focused on making it work. Making it work for who? We're focused on making it simple. Making it simple for who? We're focused on making it valuable. Making it valuable for who? And if it was as simple as producing a single checklist, we would have provided that already and we wouldn't have been hired. That's not why we're hired. We're hired to figure things out and make sense of the reality of customer conversations, unpack that, and make it a collective group sense-making approach to figure things out. And I have to remind myself that that's what we're doing. It's so counter to a lot of business practices today, but this is what executives are looking for. They're looking for that innovation. They're looking for the group to figure things out. This is a challenge that not a lot of people take on. And that's the thing that I have to embrace to make sense of what's possible, not make sense of what I already know. So that's been today's Daily Detangler. I hope this has been helpful. I was really wrestling with this over the weekend of, how do I make sense of making sense? Because so much of what we do is in the innovation space. So I wanted to structure this out. I hope this was valuable, and I look forward to your feedback.